All right. Thank you everybody for joining. Looks like we got a couple more people rolling in. Adrian, you want to switch over and grab share? You can go ahead and grab share. We'll get started. All right. Thanks, Adrian. Everybody, thank you for joining on this busy Wednesday, part 2 of our webinar series. Part 1, we kind of gave an overview and an update on how SASE is being leveraged in the marketplace. If you haven't seen that one, I recommend checking it out over on our website or on our Vimeo channel. I think we got a lot to cover today. We're going to get a little bit more technical, so I will hand it over to Kyle, and thanks again for joining.
Excellent. Thanks, Josh. Yeah, look, as you mentioned, we've got a lot to cover today. But before we get into it, let's do a little bit about us for anybody that doesn't know. Really what Resourcive is and what we focus on is we identify, quantify, and execute on value creation initiatives in mid-market and enterprise companies. A lot of them are PE owned, not all. But what we're doing is we're using technology and what's available in the market and our expertise in strategic sourcing to get those technologies implemented at our clients and create value for them and their companies. As far as kind of general intros, Kyle Hall, president of Resourcive, and Adrian, cyber practice lead, kind of did full intros on last ones and or on our last webinar in this series. So we'll skip over that given that we have a lot to cover today. Really, as far as where we're going today, this is the second in our series. Got a little latency on the slide control here, Adrian. But second in a 3-part series. So part 1 last month, and anyone can visit that on demand on our website. Really is general overview to network transformation, utilizing SASE and kind of what that framework is. Today, we're going to go pretty deep into the various components. So, we'll kind of get through a bit here early on, and then Adrian will be diving deep into each of the components in it, how they work, some of the key considerations around it, and also some of the, essentially some of the things that could be going on in companies that would indicate that this is a fit or that the timing is right. And then February 1st will be the 3rd partner series, and it'll be a lot more of the business case development. So now that we understand, the basics, we understand the components, we're going to pull that all together and start looking at, where does ROI come when this is implemented? What are some of the other costs to consider? And the management model differences, which are also a big component of that.
As far as when you want to transition, it looks like Zoom's being fun today.
Yeah, well, for what it's worth, I think you're on the other side of the world. So I guess I'm remotely flipping through your slides while you're in Portugal. We could probably use a POP-based architecture here to try to cut down on some of that latency, but we'll get into some of that. As far as why to pay attention, this section up top, I think SASE is thrown around, SSE is thrown around. We'll get into some of that. Really, most of the clients that we go and talk to, what they're fundamentally looking for is secure network as a service, right? They want to be consuming a network, know that it's secure, know that it's optimized for performance so that they can focus on the things that are more important to their business. And we see SASE and SSE as a key and integral part to that in the coming years. Obviously, there's a lot of data out there about market adoption and all of those things. We see this as nearly inevitable for the vast majority of our clients and clients that we talk to. It's just a matter of timing and what it actually looks like in their environment. Ultimately, it's a framework. It's going to look different in every single company, and so we'll get into some of the details of that. But really, as far as actionable takeaways, our intent is that attendees kind of understand what the components are, why they're important, and what some of the key considerations are around them as they look at them in their own company. Finally, as far as kind of what is SASE and SSE, I'm going to let Adrian get into the top two components here. I think the thing that is worth discussing, right? I talk about secure network as a service, and generally the clients that we talk to, they're wanting to consume that. There are other components than SASE and SSE, which is really, I'm going to greatly oversimplify it, but call it a converged edge. You also have the physical access. So whether that's broadband or wireless or even MPLS or DIA, you have a physical access layer, and then you also have a management layer. And companies can choose to either self-manage, co-manage along with a provider, or fully outsource that function to an external party, either a carrier or companies that specialize in that. We're not really going to talk about either side of that. We're really going to kind of focus on the technical components today of SASE and SSE. We see those as, really on the network side, it's largely a commoditized, thing, right? I mean, you can do some things to drive additional value there, but you're going to be limited based on the locations that you're in. And then the management style is very much a different conversation than a technical conversation. It has to do with staffing, and there are skills shortages, and some of that plays into this. But for today, we're going to really focus on the technical components kind of in the middle there, SASE and SSE. So I guess, Adrian, I'll turn it over to you to get us started here.
Yeah, so we went into this a lot more last webinar. That was more like a general wave top. So we'll very quickly brush over this. But really, secure access service edge, which is SASE, and secure service edge, which is SSE, are just concepts that were created by Gartner when they realized that there could be a better way to do both network access and security by combining some of those capabilities into cloud offerings. The real differentiator between SASE and SSE is really just the access, or the SD-WAN part of that. And there are different use cases for both. But there is a bigger shift with this whole concept, and that's removing the mindset of a trusted corporate network of some kind that you just access and get past the initial perimeter, and then you're mostly trusted. Because when you take that concept away, you still have to provide network access and security. It just looks very, very differently. And the SASE answer is to take those capabilities and push them out to the cloud. So those core components, since Gartner was the one that really created the framework and the term, they get to decide what components constitute a core capability. And those core components are software-defined wide area networks, secure web gateways, cloud access security broker, zero trust network access, and next-gen firewalls. And so SASE is all of them. SSE is just the security capabilities. If you've been in IT or security for a hot minute, then some of these services will not be a new concept, and they're not intended to be. You may be used to these services deployed on specific hardware or virtualized somewhere in your environment, but the real difference in the SASE concept is that it's all pushed to the cloud. Take whatever capability you're used to working with and push that all the way out to the control, out to the cloud, where you can control it kind of universally across your organization. And as you can imagine, that has trade-offs, just like in the traditional model of deploying them in a data center or somewhere on your perimeter and backhauling that traffic, that has disadvantages as well. So we're really just going to cover the basics of each of these components generally, and then kind of assume that you're going to be able to figure out what the in-depth background in some of those pieces are. But then we're going to discuss the considerations in deploying them to the cloud and see what that looks like on a more simplified network diagram. It's going to be a little bit better than some diagrams that I've seen that are hand-drawn that were brought up as part of this conversation, but not a full-blown network diagram by any means. And really, at the end of the day, it's also important to note that we're discussing these individual concepts so that you can make the best choice for your organization. Just because something fits into the SASE concept doesn't mean that it's the right answer for an organization every time. But that's one of the advantages of SASE, is you can do this piecemeal and deploy these capabilities individually, and we'll get into that a little bit further. So one more kind of piece of admin as we get going is I want to quickly introduce this very bare bones network diagram. And that's because we're going to be using this to describe some of the capabilities and components. So in front of you is a very cleverly named example company, and they have one headquarters in New York, and 3 branch offices that you can see in Tokyo, London, and Los Angeles. They also have a data center in New York, but that's going to be in a different location than their actual headquarters. And since the CIO and CISO partnered with Resourcive, to source and implement their digital transformations, they both listened to Muji for their hypergrowth investment strategies. The Resourcive as a podcast episode is coming out soon. They're actually on their yachts in the Bahamas and the Mediterranean. They're going to serve the roles as the remote workers that we're going to have. I hope you guys can also one day be on a yacht, #remote work. In the bottom right, we're indicating some generic SaaS or hosted applications that are not running on company-controlled sites. So these are not controlled by the actual example company. And the overall point is that these cloud services contain sensitive or proprietary data that belongs to your business. So as an IT or security leader, you likely care about securing it. But these services also have different quality of service requirements. Like a contact center is going to need a different amount of bandwidth and reliability than the DocuSign loading for the legal department. Okay, all of that, let's move. All that done, let's move forward. Actually, Cal, do you have anything to add to this?
I would just say, like your jokes aside, right? I think this represents, generally speaking, a lot of what we see in clients, right? You've got remote workers out there somewhere, even if they're not on a yacht. You need to access SaaS applications. More and more companies we go into, or even, especially when we're having early conversations, they're near infrastructureless. So it's SaaS first, methodology, but you still need to ensure that you're securing it or accessing it and securing it. And then you've got branch locations spread out. And, I think the piece of note there is that they are geographically dispersed. That'll, we'll get into it on the SD-WAN. I know you're going to dive into that point, but I think this is not uncommon for what we see as far as what you have. You've got an HQ, you got a data center, cloud workloads, remote, and branch office. That's what we see when we go into companies, in various forms.
Yeah, and so we won't talk about connectivity at all because it doesn't matter, because we'll get into that right now. So having said that, let's kick off with some SD-WAN conversation. So chances are you already have some SD-WAN deployed across your network. But if you're a growing company or doing network modernization or the occasional MPLS migration, let's just run through it real quick. So it stands for Software Defined Wide Area Network. And that essentially means that you're taking a new way to transmit traffic from a site or branch using software-based controllers and transmitting that in different architectures. So the software controller allows you to use multiple connections and bridge or bond those, and then dynamically steer that traffic based on your priority for it. That can remove some requirements for private connections and their associated costs, but that's something to look at, right? That's what's driving this conversation is cost a lot of the time. You can change things like what routes your traffic takes, change priority of traffic for essential protocols, applications, use specific connections for specific traffic if you do want to maintain private networks, and bond different connections, whether that's like 5G as a backup to your main broadband connection or fiber connection. That's a capability that SD-WAN offers. And generally, this is accomplished by hardware inline bridging a site and the associated connectivity to that site. And that abstracts away the underlying actual physical network. And instead, you overlay this virtual network on top of it. And that, again, is transparent to the actual site and the users. They would just see network access, and they don't really care about what connection their individual traffic's riding over. Some of these are combined with firewalls, but now we're mixing capabilities, so we won't get into it. Generally, the architectures behind this are edge, gateway, and POP-based architectures. And we're going to get that into a little bit more deeply on the next side. But that's kind of the first breakdown. I know that was a lot. So
yeah, the thing I would add, and kind of generally speaking, as we roll through these, we're going to talk a little bit about considerations and when. So some of the considerations here, if you have traditionally been doing CapEx hardware purchases at your edge, whether it's in routers that you're self-managing or more likely firewalls, this could be a different model, right? So you want to consider that the impact on the business, what feedback you're getting from finance and what their approach to that would be. So that's kind of one component here. The other is this management model. We'll talk a lot about that in the next one, in the next kind of episode in our series here. But if you have been potentially self-managing this, your edge infrastructure, whether it's your router and I'll just generally speak about your router and your firewall. If you've been self-managing it, going to a co-managed or a fully managed is going to have implications for your staffing. Additionally, if you're switching technology and you don't have that expertise in-house, you need to consider what the management model is going to be. Certainly, anyone that has been a traditional Cisco network engineer, is going to either be able to pick up the Cisco-based SD-WAN solutions or any of the other ones. Like, they're going to have a strong enough foundation to be able to get up to speed in those. But this is something that you want to consider as an IT leader, looking at your staff and also looking at this technology. And then finally, the private backbones, which we'll get into a lot on the next one, but at a very high level, right? The example company here is geographically dispersed, going into an edge-based SD-WAN. When you may have some traffic tagging, you may be able to do some things, but ending up in a best effort on the middle mile may not be ideal. And so we'll talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and we've seen. Keep going.
Oh, I was just gonna say, as far as when, Adrian, I mean, I've seen a lot of clients migrating from MPLS, but what are some of the other things where you see clients, like, these are kind of key decision points where they're saying, hey, like, this may be the time? Because again, like, back to my opening statements, I see this as inevitable for most companies. It's just a decision of when is the time right to kind of minimize the lift or align with other strategic objectives.
Yeah, the ability that SD-WAN kind of gives you, especially when you're talking about it from like a cloud-based SASE architecture, is really helpful when you're already like migrating from MPLS, because it gives you that same priority of traffic and to be able, the ability to filter or prioritize different application level traffic. But also, like, as you start expanding into multiple branches, the like overhead requirement for actually setting up new networks makes it a lot easier if you have some templates that are already built out in your SD-WAN providing. Like, it's just kind of, you just slap it on top, right? You already know what that architecture is going to look like. And if you're already doing a network redesign or upgrade, it becomes a lot easier and smarter to start implementing some of the newer SD-WAN technologies, because you are going to get greater configuration and ability to manage that traffic and get better quality of service and like user experience for your actual organization. For those that need high availability, like, this is a great way to move away from the expensive MPLS dual networks and instead just have some really reliable or multiple different categories of connectivity, and prioritizing your highest risk apps and the things that you absolutely need to have your business run. But have you seen any others, Kyle?
No, the other one I would say would be this kind of bottom one, right? When you're moving your workloads around, right? A network may have been built to, even in our example company here, right? You've got some of your, you can jump to the example company slide. I know you're going to build it out, but you've got workloads in this New York data center, which you're now moving to AWS, right? That the network to support that for your end users to access it changes as well, right? So I think that's one of the bigger ones. I mean, in my mind, and even in conversations with our clients, when we're talking about network, it starts with applications. Tell me what you're running, tell me how you're using it.
Yeah, and SD-WAN really comes down in like those architectures that you were talking about earlier, right? So it's like edge, gateway, and POP-based architectures, and there are like certain use cases that can be used. But since we're moving towards SASE, I wanted to like cover these so that everybody understood what like the real capability versus historical capability has been. And so like you'll see red edge-based popping up, that it really just takes two devices at two sites. You were referring to that earlier, and you're using the WAN connections that you actually have to those sites to talk directly to those devices and trying to shape that traffic, based off of what connectivity you may have at that site and prioritizing, but you're really losing some of the more advanced capability that I'll get into in a minute, because you don't control the networks that are between the site and the headquarters, right? Like we're using the generic cloud internet overview because we don't know what that looks like. And so when you get into the next one, which is gateway, you think edge, but instead someone else is running that second piece. And so that's a portal. And that gives more ability to shape or understand the metrics in the traffic between a site and the gateway. But think multi-tenant gateway in a data center or a provider, like sticking that edge endpoint, that gateway into like nearby other SaaS services. And so this is really helpful for those businesses where that gateway may be almost like next door or very in the same data center as a lot of the same SaaS services that they're using. And so that is really, really fast. But you're still not optimizing for any other traffic that they're not really next to, because you're still depending on the rest of the internet. And so when you move forward from there, you get to kind of like the SASE convergence piece, which is point of presence. And that's really when I guess, think gateways, but with the provider also using some type of private backbone to prioritize that actual traffic between those points of presence. So in this case, we're just showing the Los Angeles piece, but we'll get into like a bigger network diagram momentarily. But over large distances, this private network can give some huge advantages, because you don't just have to transmit like traffic for your data center, but you can also optimize traffic based on your configuration for all those cloud and SaaS apps that are still useful for your business. So YouTube may load slowly because it's using the regular internet, but you're optimizing your AWS infrastructure, you're optimizing your contact center traffic to really make sure that you're able to do those business functions. And so,
yeah, and Adrian, I know we have a lot to get into, but just a quick example, because I think sometimes that helps. It's not always just cloud applications either. I mean, we had a client, they had, through mergers and acquisitions, had like 7 different ERPs. One of them was in Malaysia, and they wanted the Malaysia site to be running on an ERP that was hosted on at one of their sites in the UK. And what was happening, they had carrier provided internet, had firewalls, had that type of stuff, but they weren't really doing any any traffic. They didn't have control of their traffic in the middle mile. When you don't have control of your traffic in the middle mile, you are essentially subject to the peering relationships between these internet providers. And so Malaysia Telecom, they were able to get some reports of this traffic. This traffic for their ERP was going back and forth across the Pacific 3 times, and then going into the UK and finally ending up where it needed to be, which is like, that wasn't working, right? And so they had this kind of key thing that needed to be solved for them to be able to pull that ERP in. We deployed a POP-based SD-WAN solution. It was Cato. We didn't deploy it across the whole network. We really just started and deployed it at the Malaysia site, at the UK site, knocked the latency way down. And really what's happening is from the edge, there's a device in Malaysia. It is finding the closest Cato POP and then getting on, call it a highway, an interstate, directly to the closest POP in the UK to that site. And so you're taking control of this middle mile, and that's the private backbone that you're referencing here. And just, an example of what it actually looks like in a business.
Yeah. And so a lot of people, one of our considerations in the last slide was like CapEx versus OpEx expenditures. And like, if you're refreshing your firewalls, or really in this case, your SD-WAN devices every 3 to 5 years as new technology comes out, you're really like going through a lot of transition. Whereas in this type of architecture, those edge devices are really just like bare bones, helping you figure out how to do the traffic based on your connections. And the real capability for managing that traffic over the private backbone happens at the POP. And so really, you don't have to worry about a lot of that at all. And configurations are pulled from there. And if you don't need to worry about that, that connectivity and multiple connections too much, then those devices can get real simple, and you can reuse your existing devices as long as they're capable of creating an IPsec tunnel.
Yep.
All right, I think we beat that one to death. So now we'll go into another example. But as you expand that whole POP concept, right, just from those 3 guys, it goes back into what you're talking about how that private backbone really can link all these branches from Tokyo, London, Los Angeles, and provide good quality of service all the way across to the CIO's yacht in the Bahamas, right? And again, we get into the difference between SASE and SSE. In SSE, there really isn't the access requirement, but in SSE, when you're using a strong SASE provider, you're still leveraging the private backbone for a lot of that traffic, even though you're not steering some of the traffic out of your site with connectivity and everything. So you still do benefit some of that. I can't think off the top of my head that is of anyone that is doing a pure that's doing a SASE kind of discussion that is also doing gateway or edge-based SD-WAN, you could probably piecemeal some of those together. But as soon as you start discussing SASE, you generally start assuming that you're going to be doing a POP-based architecture. All right, let's roll on. Secure web gateway. So now we've moved from the access piece to the security guys, and we'll start kind of moving a little bit quicker through this because they're not as difficult concepts to understand. But the two that are most confused, and since we're talking capabilities, some of these do merge together. So secure web gateway and cloud access security broker are confused, and some of the capability is duplicated based off of what provider you're looking at, but we'll separate them just for this because that's how Gartner categorizes it. So a secure web gateway is a service that provides screening and filtering of web traffic, period, right? So what does that mean? In general, it sits between the users and the internet and applies corporate policies to that traffic. It does that through URL filtering, malicious code detection, and filtering of that malicious code based off signature detection or behavioral detection. It can have application controls for web-based applications, but this is a little bit more limited generally because that's more of a feature for the CASB. And it can do some data loss prevention depending on the vendor, as well as some introspection into traffic to block malware. But really, at the end of the day, when we were discussing at the beginning of the transition to SASE, as you transition from an edge where secure web gateways used to be, or at a branch as traffic left, when you remove that, you really have to put it in the cloud. And so you have to put it in the cloud because otherwise you lose the ability to actually scan all the different traffic across this dispersed network architecture that you're creating with remote users in different branches. Another real great capability is that it's going to universally apply these policies across all remote workers, all on-premise workers, and everyone that's involved in the whole organization. So you can also, really at the end of the day, if you're going in to configure every single secure web gateway per site and per user, it's going to be a large amount of overhead as opposed to the SASE offering that really consolidates a lot of that. Lastly, there is some fine-grained control. You can put these people into like security groups. So HR can have access to the HR apps, but maybe finance doesn't need it, so they don't have access to that same type of thing. But that's all done at a more basic URL blocking level. It's not really getting into the access. I know that was a lot.
No, all good. I mean, as far as considerations, I think one of the key ones, and this is why a lot of these things have to be cloud-based. And it's interesting that kind of COVID happened at the time SASE was gaining steam, and you went to this work from home. Without this being a cloud-based service, you're either going to end up in a situation where you're managing it at the edge at all branches, or you're going to hairpin traffic. You're going to have to backhaul it to your data center or wherever you're hosting this solution to pass all traffic through, which really is just not feasible, not sustainable for most of the clients that we work with, especially as you move to more and more SaaS-based applications that are delivered from the web, right? So as far as when we see this, either like you annotated here, a recommendation from a security audit, something like that, or wrapping it into a network redesign or remote work, just because, other than a VPN for remote work, how are you going to bring that traffic back and then scrub it? Well, this is a solution to do that.
Yeah. And so when you actually try to figure out how this all fits together, there's really two different types of deployments, and one is SASE based, and the other one is still kind of SASE based, but it's not really ideal. And so you're talking about a single point deployment or POP based deployment. I'm sure you can guess which one I'm going to prefer. But we're going to look at a single deployment first. And in this case, we're going to have only one instance of their secure web gateway, and traffic from both Tokyo and New York have to go to that gateway, right? So we're almost recreating our hairpinning discussion and our VPN issues. And so it's not very efficient. But this may be okay depending on your organization's dispersion if you don't have a lot of different international setups. But At the end of the day, it does require traffic to pass through. And that sounds like a dumb thing to say, except for unmanaged devices that you may have on your network or for bring your own device for your organization. If you can't configure those devices, you can't really enforce that the secure web gateway is in use. So they generally need to be managed by you, right? And in this particular example, you can see that fine-grained control where marketing is allowed to Twitter, but maybe HR, we don't want to be, discussing or looking at those types of things. And so rolling on, the other piece is POP-based, right? And so when you do that, you're really putting the secure web gateway capability universally applied across all the POPs. And when traffic enters from a branch or the HQ, it's filtered based off whatever policies you want. Same policies, but way faster because they're combining that private backbone, but also the dispersion of the service being provided to you. This can reduce a lot of the latency issue we talked about. And again, since it's the same across each POP, you get uniform filtering across the world, including for remote people, as long as those devices are managed.
Yeah, and I mean, it's worth noting kind of one of the things we look at when we're going out and sourcing this, right, is we're looking at where those POPs are at for the providers. I mean, I don't know off the top of my head, but most of the reputable providers in this space are going to have a POP in Tokyo, right? So you're ending up with almost a Metro E type connection versus, I think about it like on a map. I guess I'm geographically oriented, but when I think about it that way, and I think about the traffic, in a traditional model where maybe this is hosted in the New York data center, right? You're backhauling that all the way to New York, and then scrubbing it versus a metro type connection. That was pretty impactful.
So Cloud Access Security Broker, the second one, it's very similar. It instead focuses on providing more fine-grained access controls for web applications. So think I'm going to log in and try log into Salesforce and export all of our client data from my home computer right as I got fired because we didn't actually cut off my access in time, right? But that's going to be stopped. Generally, there's 4 tenets that they talk about that CASB offers, and it's visibility into all of the traffic and the access and how things are happening. Compliance, so the ability to prove that those controls are in effect, threat prevention by the controls that you're implementing, and really the data security piece of that. It's going to accomplish this by filtering web application traffic. Again, it's still at the application layer, and providing access control to sanctioned apps and blocking unsanctioned apps. You can also add context to logins like the operating system, managed device, or patch level. You can do some DLP, but we'll roll continued into this, and it really comes into agent versus agentless. You can kind of understand what those are. Managed devices versus like unmanaged devices are really the trade-off there. But the real capability under like limitation is forward versus reverse proxy or API based, and we'll get into that on the next slide. So again, that is one of the considerations, but the other one is really like, do they support your web apps, your infrastructure, and the authentication system that you want to link it to, like Azure Active Directory or however you're doing your identification, right?
Yeah, I think when we talk about, any SASE deployment is going to look a little bit different, and like selecting the tools that are in there and mapping those. It's like in this space, right? It's really going to depend on what the core line of business apps are. What SaaS applications, have data in them of that client that they want to protect, and then mapping that and ensuring that the CASB solution in play for this particular SASE provider maps to that, right? It's just kind of a gotcha, right? And I think there's a lot of gotchas in this space, but it's an example of one.
Yeah. And so like a lot of these more discussion pieces we'll cover in the example company again. But so the real takeaway is, or the real discussion point is forward proxy, reverse proxy, API. So we'll do API first because it's the easiest and it's in red, as you can see. But API capability is basically integrating with that web app and applying some DLP processes, right? So scanning any information that exists in that web app. So that could be Office 365, it could be Salesforce, it could be like AWS S3 buckets, but you're looking for like whatever that is. So it could be like credit card data or PII or, whatever else, but also helping identify whether that's shared outside the organization. and adjusting that sharing based off of your corporate policies. So that's the easy one. Forward proxy is also kind of easy because it's exactly what IT people think of when we discuss forward proxy. You know, in this case, the CIO's yacht is going to connect to the CASB, which is then going to reach out and serve as an intermediary to, in this case, the Salesforce app, right? And it's going to be able to provide a little bit more fine-grained control and only allow the CIO based off the API, you know, based off of Salesforce's proprietary API that they expose. And that will link in to drive what the CASB is capable of doing. So it can't generally do data at rest, but can do data in motion filtering. So reverse proxy is where it gets weird. So in this case, the CISO, who should know better, is going to try to access Salesforce directly with their own credentials. But because we've linked Salesforce to our CASB and some type of SSO option, then Salesforce is going to notify the CASB, which is then going to transition back to, hey, you have to re-authenticate because you are unable to log in with those credentials. And so now all that traffic kind of turns into that forward proxy kind of conversation, where it will allow that all the in-route data introspection and stuff like that. So the good side is that that is very helpful for sanctioned applications. But if it's unsanctioned applications, then you really can't do that because unsanctioned applications also aren't linked to your SSO. So we'll keep going because we're running out of time, and we'll roll into zero trust network access. Now, this one is more of a concept, but really it's any service that covers that kind of concept. And that's going to be allowing fine-grained access controls based off of identity, the context of the request, and whatever corporate policy you're applying to that, whether it's like OS or patch level, managed device, things like that. So really it's based off of a couple tenets, and that's don't trust anyone until they're verified, assume that there is a breach on the network, and always grant the least privilege access as much as possible. So this applies to both users and services and data. And so services like web applications should only interact with other services that it should be authorized, and it shouldn't know about any other resources on the network. That even that device or that role should have no visibility into any other aspects in the network because you're assuming that it's already been compromised. So this is really, like advancing the software defined perimeter concept. And it removes a VPN because it does have that encryption per access role and per request to your internal services. So you no longer want to have a VPN where you just VPN in and then you trust everything from there. And this kind of replaces that. So I am going to roll it through some of the more technical considerations like role-based access control versus attribute access control. And really the difficulty you're going to run into is integrating legacy services that maybe don't have SSO options or fine-grained controls within them. Like once you log in, you have access to everything. You can't really change that if you're if that's how the web app is built, or internal app, depending on what it may be. If you've already spent a lot of money in a VPN investment, it may not be the time, but you can also piecemeal that solution on. I truly believe that you should do this right now because this will stop most east-west movement inside your network once a compromise or a breach happens. And that's really what we're doing, is we're reducing the amount of time and the amount of damage that happens from a compromise because it is kind of inevitable. Any other comments? All right, I'm going to keep going. So next gen firewall, there was no example for that one because it's more of a concept and that service is hard to describe on a map. But next gen firewall, we will just breeze over this based off time because this is probably, besides SD-WAN, the one that people are most familiar with. Really, traditional firewalls have been advanced with behavioral analytics and traffic inspection and additional logging. And this really integrates well with other security services, like having a SOC on board is going to be able to go back and introspect into some of the network traffic based off firewall logs and things like that. In this case, we are thinking about it like cloud, right? Because we're going to look at the same POP architecture, but now we're not going to have an expensive device at the actual edge. Now we'll have something that just helps doing a little bit of initial SD-WAN steering, but also the firewall is running on the POP as well. And so that really reduces the amount of like encryption and decryption that you're doing based on all these services as well.
Yeah, I think the one super important note you didn't hit on the previous slide, just because we're time condensed here, is you're not having to go and pull and refresh these firewalls. You know, you're running a software update, right? And you're pushing capability through the portal, or the provider is pushing additional capabilities through the portal, which is, you know, for most clients I speak with, a welcome change.
And so that is all of the core components. We'll breeze through these non-core ones first, but you can see them on the screen. But really, in my perspective, non-core are things that augment some of those services. So there are other features of a CASB that a vendor may strap on because it's already integrated in that technology. Whereas component adjacent are capabilities that a vendor may provide, like Cloudflare has a SASE offering, but you also may be doing CDN and WAF and DDoS protection through them. So that may be a really good conversation driver for your organization if you're already employing those services.
Yeah, I look at these things as like other strategic initiatives that you can wrap in, right? I mean, we're always looking to do that, and it does positively affect the business case typically if some of that stuff's on your roadmap already, or if there are you know, other vendors that are performing that, and you can get some efficiency of scale and wrap them all.
So I really wanted to drive forward to this slide because this is the rest of the considerations. And a lot of these are universal across the components, having gone over them, but really phased implementation, both of the component. If that is helpful for your organization, you don't have to implement all these things at once. You can turn them on whenever you're ready. So if you already have legacy firewalls, you can do the rest and turn the firewalls on when your old ones expire for contracts. Multiple decryption of traffic. We've kind of talked about that. If you have all these services layered, if each one is decrypting traffic, introspecting, running the service, and then re-encrypting it, you're wasting a lot of overhead. And that can be really reduced if you find a single vendor solution that is decrypting it once, running all of the analysis, and then re-encrypting it for transport. Integration with other services is always going to be your piece, especially with other security services. So it's always going to be a consideration, because if your SOC isn't capable of monitoring the network that's happening through all of these SASE offerings, then really you're not getting the same level of security from that SOC in the first place. SASE does scale generally a lot better. Like you can easily add 10 more sites if you just install like SASE agents on each of your computers and just get connectivity to a site, right? That's easy, as opposed to having to build a new architecture for each and every one. And generally, we've hit on it a couple times, but configuration portal, if you can do it all at once and then push it out across the entire organization at once, that is really going to reduce the misconfiguration errors across your organization. And really, remote support and VPN, like, do you need it if with zero trust network access? Not really. And that's why the whole world is moving towards this in the IT space. Last kind of consideration is the quality of offerings within the SASE provider. I hate to say it, but like some people hate, you know, if you know, certain firewalls based off pricing, based off capability. And if you're going with their SASE offering, I don't expect that those things are going to get better. So choose a solution that you're comfortable with and that you have the in-house experience with. And there are a lot more considerations, like Kyle hit on, that are business case related that we are really going to dive into in the next webinar. So please register, because we would love to see you there as well.
Yeah, I'm excited about the next one, really kind of pulling it all together from a business perspective, right? So, you know, by that, essentially, we'll be talking about not only the access, not only the kind of middle, the SASE or SSE component, but also the management model, and then how to go about thinking through the business case there. And, you know, moving forward with adoption, again, like we see this as inevitable, you know, in some way, shape, or form. Every company is going to look a little bit different in how they do it, but we see it as inevitable. You know, we kind of think it's our place in the market to be talking about this, and also talking about it from a business case perspective, not just the technology. So I'm excited for the next one. That'll be on February 1st. So you know, hope to see many of you there.
Yeah. And thank you everyone for attending. Sorry for going a little bit over time. We brushed through that. We will be, we greatly invite you to hop on a call. We'd be happy to discuss any of this ad nauseum. I love discussing this with our clients and really trying to find the best solution for them. And these are all just some of the considerations that we generally get into discussing. And with that, I will hand it back over to Josh.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian.